Welcome to another deep dive. We're tackling the history of punishment today, specifically that shift away from public torture and execution.
Yeah. It always seems like, we just became more humane, right? More civilized.
That's what we like to think, but I have a feeling it's a lot more complicated.
Oh, absolutely. Way more to it.
Well, thankfully, we've got Foucault to guide us. His Discipline and Punish is dense, but really eye-opening on this topic.
It's a classic for a reason. Foucault argues that how a society punishes says a lot about its power structures.
Right. It's not just about being nicer to criminals.
Not at all. It's about, like, a total shift in the whole goal of punishment, what it was FOR.
And he contrasts these two scenes to illustrate that.
Yeah. One from 1757 and then one from the 1830s, less than 100 years apart, but totally different worlds punishment-wise.
So give us the 1757 scene. Set the stage, as they say.
Okay, so Paris, 1757. We've got the execution of Robert-François d'Amiens.
This is the guy who,
Tried to kill King Louis XV. Big no-no back then.
Understatement. So how'd they handle that?
They went all out. I mean, the punishment was supposed to be just as horrific as the crime itself to make a statement.
We're talking like full-on public torture then.
Oh, yeah. Gruesome stuff. Like, they'd tear his flesh with hot pincers, pour molten lead and boiling oil into the wounds.
Oh, that's awful.
And that was just the warm-up act. Then came the execution itself. Drawn and quartered by horses.
You mean like...
Literally pulled apart. Brutal.
It's hard to imagine that kind of thing being so, like, normal back then.
It was.
Sure.
And Foucault's point is, it wasn't really just about Damiens. It was about power. The king showing everyone who's boss. Both the guy being punished and the whole crowd watching.
A message to the people. This is what happens when you step out of line.
Exactly. Don't mess with the king. So then, fast forward to the 1830s, what's our other scene?
Yeah, what's changed?
Instead of a public square, we're now in a prison. Foucault uses this timetable from the House of Young Prisoners in Paris. It's all about, like, strict daily routine. Wake-up time, work time, meals, even recreation. All precisely timed and controlled.
So instead of this chaotic public spectacle of pain...
We've got order, regimentation. Everything's scheduled, controlled.
And that shows a different purpose behind punishment, right?
Totally. It's not about breaking the body anymore. Now it's about disciplining the soul.
Okay, so that's a phrase we hear a lot, but what does it actually mean to punish the soul?
Think less about physical pain, more about control. Depriving rights, reforming behavior. Instead of just punishing the ACT, it's about changing the person.
Ah, okay. So it's a shift from the body, which everyone can see, to this inner self.
Yeah, exactly. Less eye for an eye, and more about molding the criminal into something new.
Which has all sorts of implications, right? Like suddenly the courts have to think about psychology, the criminal's background, their potential for reform.
It's a huge change. And, it's funny, you'd think moving away from torture would be purely a good thing, right?
Seems like obvious progress.
But Foucault makes us wonder, is it really that simple? Have we just found new, more subtle forms of control? Because even in this new system, the physical doesn't totally go away.
Wait, how so?
Think solitary confinement, strict rations, forced labor. They might not be public spectacles, but they're still physical ways of enforcing order.
Ah, good point.
So Foucault asks this question, is purely non-corporal punishment even possible? Something to think about.
It is. But before we go too far down that road, let's go back to those public executions for a bit. You mentioned they were almost like political theater.
Oh, they were totally staged events,
Mm-hmm.
meant to, like, awe and terrify people. Imagine this. The condemned is paraded through the streets, often with these placards on them.
Like signs?
Yeah, describing their crime. They're basically props in this whole performance.
Wow. So there's the procession, the scaffold, the big crowd. It's a production.
A huge production. Even the executioner was part of the show. Sometimes they'd get punished if they weren't skillful enough.
No pressure. But it makes sense if the goal is to make this big display of the sovereign's power.
Right, to really drive home that message. Don't even think about messing with the crown. But here's where things get interesting. Even with all that control, the public's role in these events wasn't always predictable.
Oh, really? How so?
It was like this weird carnival atmosphere. People expected a show, they'd yell insults at the person being punished. And sometimes crowds would even riot, trying to save someone from the gallows.
Wow. So even in this carefully constructed spectacle, there was this possibility of things going off script.
Exactly. That unpredictability is what starts to make the authorities nervous. Yeah, like, what if the crowd starts sympathizing with the criminal? Or even turns against the authorities? That's not a good look for the king.
Definitely not the message they were going for. But as this public spectacle fades away, we see this new focus on the criminal's soul. It's not like everyone suddenly got all enlightened overnight, though, right?
No, not at all. But you got to think about the historical context. This is the Enlightenment, right? Science, reason, all that jazz. People are starting to see humans differently.
So how did that play out in the justice system? Did courts just ditch punishment and start offering group therapy instead?
Huh. Not quite. But they did start incorporating these new ideas about the mind. Like, take how they viewed madness. In the early 1800s, if you were declared insane, you weren't guilty. Straightforward, no crime.
Not guilty by reason of insanity. We still have that.
Exactly. But as we move through the 19th century, it gets more complicated. Madness doesn't always equal freedom.
Interesting.
Instead of just guilty or not guilty, courts start considering degrees of guilt.
Ah, so your mental state could affect your sentence.
Yeah, insanity might mean a lighter sentence or a different kind of punishment altogether.
So the crime's still a crime, but who you are mentally starts to matter.
Huge change. And it leads to this whole new group of people in the courtroom. Psychiatrists, psychologists, criminologists. It's not just judges and juries deciding what happens to you anymore.
Which makes you wonder, who really holds the power there? Is it the judge with the gavel or the expert giving their opinion?
That's the kind of question Foucault wants us to grapple with. But it is important to say, this shift from body to soul, complicated as it is, it did have some good sides too.
Oh, like what?
Well, for one, it led to a better understanding of why people commit crimes. Instead of just assuming everyone who breaks the law is evil.
Right, there has to be some reason, right?
It started to consider poverty, mental illness, all those social factors.
So instead of just punishing, they started thinking about rehabilitation.
Exactly. The idea that people can change, become productive members of society again. Much more hopeful view of human nature than just an eye for an eye.
It's progress, at least in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. And it lays the groundwork for prison reform, social work, the whole idea of a more humane approach to punishment. Of course, there were still problems, injustices, but it's a significant step.
Okay, so we've got this big shift in how we think about punishment. But we can't forget about the public's fascination with crime, right? We've come a long way from those public executions, but something about these stories still grabs us.
For sure. And it makes you wonder, has the spectacle just changed form? Instead of gathering to watch an execution, are we now glued to true crime podcasts, documentaries?
That's a good question. We might not have the physical brutality, but are we still enacting that same judgment, that need to see someone punished just from a safe distance?
Exactly. We've traded the literal scaffold for a metaphorical one. So we get to consume these stories, dissect them, decide who's guilty, who's innocent, all from our comfy chairs.
And it's easy to forget there are real people behind these stories, both the victims and the accused.
Right. Foucault would probably say we're still caught up in this whole system of judging and punishing, even if it feels more intellectual now.
And the media plays a huge role, right? How they report on crime, the stories they choose to tell, it all shapes how we see justice.
Totally. It's almost like we're still looking for that same sense of order being restored, the kind people got from those public executions.
Except now it's more personal. Less about the king's power, more about our own individual need to engage with these stories, to make our own WN judgments.
Right. It makes you think, are we really honoring the victims by consuming these stories? Or is it just entertainment for us? It's a tough question, but it's exactly the kind of critical thinking Foucault wants us to do. He's not giving us easy answers. He's pushing us to see those power dynamics, even in something as simple as our entertainment.
So we've gone from bloody spectacles to these supposedly humane systems. But have we really escaped that urge to judge and punish? Or have we just found new ways to do it? It really makes you think. So to bring it back to all this material you've shared, we've been tracing this shift from public torture to focusing on the criminal's soul. But is that really progress? Or, like Foucault suggests, have we just found sneakier ways to control people?
It's a question worth asking, especially given your interest in true crime, right? Is our obsession with these podcasts, documentaries, is that kind of a new version of the spectacle we've been talking about?
It's fascinating because we have moved away from the physical brutality of public executions. But are we still enacting that same judgment, that need to see someone punished, just from afar?
Right. We've traded the literal scaffold for this metaphorical one, where we can consume these stories, analyze everything, and decide who's guilty, all from our living rooms.
And it's easy to forget these are real people involved on all sides, the victims, the accused.
Absolutely. Foucault would probably point out we're still very much caught up in this system of judging and punishing, even if it feels more intellectualized now.
And the media plays such a big role. How they report on crime, the narratives they spin, that all shapes how we see justice.
It's true. It's almost like we're still seeking that same sense of order being restored that people got from public executions back then.
Except now it's more personal, less about the king's power, more about our own individual need to engage with these stories, to make our own judgments.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, are we truly honoring the victims by consuming these stories? Or is it just a form of entertainment for us?
It's a tough one to answer.
It is. But that's the kind of critical thinking Foucault is pushing us towards. He's not giving us easy answers. He's making us see the complexity of it all, the power dynamics that are always at play, even in something as seemingly simple as what we choose to watch or listen to.
So to sum it all up, we've gone from these bloody public spectacles to supposedly humane systems, but have we really escaped that urge to judge and punish?
Maybe not. Maybe we've just found new ways to express it.
Which is what makes discipline and punish so relevant, even now. It's not just about history, it's about understanding power in our own world and being critical of our own roles in these systems.
Exactly. Whether we're literally watching from the public square or just through our phone screens.
Such great insights. And if anyone out there is feeling inspired to do some more digging, Discipline and Punish is definitely worth checking out. It's not an easy read, but man, is it powerful. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds open.